In the cattle town of Douglas, Wyoming, end of the trail for a smart aleck gunman. Components of his arsenal are shown here after he was taken into custody. A trail of 11 killings from Lincoln, Nebraska into Wyoming. A 3-day spree until Charles Starkweather, 19, landed behind prison bars. A News of the Day correspondent with 16-millimeter camera made these scenes of Starkweather, which were enlarged for your theater screen.
From Omaha, Nebraska, the capital city of the historic, haunted heartland, my name is Brian Corey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this episode of the world-famous Necronomicast. For this exclusive episode, it is my pleasure to welcome to the show New York Times best-selling author, Harry MacLean. Harry and I, we're going to take you on a journey through the desolate backroads and farmlands of 1958 Lincoln, Nebraska, in search of the truth behind the shocking events of the most horrific killing spree in modern American history. In his new book, Starkweather, The Untold Story of the Killing Spree That Changed America, Harry takes us back to a time where the idyllic landscape of the Midwest was changed forever due to the murderous rampage of Charles Starkweather. And now calling in on the Necronomicast hotline, I'm very excited, very proud to present to you all writer Harry MacLean, author of Starkweather, The Untold Story of the Killing Spree That Changed America. Harry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. You know, I'm an Omaha guy. I'm in my late 40s, and the name Starkweather has, haunted this part of the country since before I was born. My dad was 70 when I was born. He was born in 1904. So I heard the name Starkweather growing up a lot from my mom and my dad talking about, my dad thought Starkweather was, both of them, him and Carol were guilty. My mom had a little bit more sympathy toward Carol. And so when I saw that a native Nebraskan was writing this book, and really it's the definitive account of the murders, the trial, just everything that went into that whole tumultuous time here in Nebraska. When I saw that a native Nebraskan was writing the book, I was very, very excited to get a copy of it and read it for myself, and because I think we would have a unique perspective being from Nebraska.
Yeah, we come from an old Lincoln family. It goes back 4 or 5 generations. And my brother and I grew up there. He was in a shop class at Irving Junior High with Charlie, and used to tell the story of how one time during recess, he and a couple other guys went in and glued whatever Charlie was making, like a sailboat or something, and glued it to the bench. And then were greatly amused when Charlie came in and couldn't pick it up. That anecdote kind of speaks to the ongoing hassle that Charlie, whatever you want to call it, abuse or hassle that Charlie endured during his schoolyard days. And we lived on 24th Street, about a mile away from the Ward house where Lauer and Clara Ward were murdered along with the maid. We knew the Wards. My parents socialized with them. I knew Mike, the son that was away at prep school. And as a matter of fact, we went to the same college. So we were kind of part of the scene as it unraveled.
You spoke a little bit about there. You had a little firsthand knowledge about the bullying that Charlie endured. Now, he was kind of a slight kid, came from a lower middle class family. The pictures really, like when you see a picture of Charlie Starkweather, everybody says, "Oh, he kind of looks like a doppelganger for James Dean," with the hair, the look, the attitude, the dangling cigarette out of the mouth. But he was picked on mercilessly a lot when he was younger, especially because he was bow-legged. He had kind of a speech impediment, not a very bright kid. And so he kind of learned how to, handle his frustrations with his fists.
Well, he also was short. He was 5'5", where the average male at that time was 5'8", and he was bow-legged. And he also had flaming red hair, which he got from his mother. and he was also slightly pigeon-toed. So if you just look at his face or his headshot, he does resemble James Dean a lot. But if you look at the entire person, the entire body, he attracted a lot of attention because of his physique. Let's put it that way. And kids were cruel, and we all know how cruel kids can be. And once somebody gets identified as an object of derision, it gets its own momentum, and that carried him through till one day he came home and his dad saw the shape that he was in and said he had called the school several times about it, about the bullying without any result. And so he said, look, the next time this happens, you don't need to sit there and take it. You can smack them back. And that's what Charlie started doing. And by the time he left Irving Junior High, he was a terror. I mean, he was beating people up right and left.
Yeah, it wasn't so much of him defending himself that after a while. It was more of him going out and looking for trouble.
Yeah, and he sought it out. I mean, there'd be some guy standing across the street from him, a third bigger than he was, and he'd see what he thought was a look on his face or maybe just the way he was dressed, and he'd go over and start punching the guy. And it wasn't the normal schoolyard fight. It went beyond that. If you got the person on the ground, he would kick him. On other times, there are other instances where he would rub their face into the gravel. So it expanded, but it kind of fueled his anger. Mm-hmm. It was a way to bring it out and act it out, and he did.
So he was born in 1938. By the time he turned about 19 years old, 18, 19 years old, he dropped out of school. His interests were cars, and didn't have much of a career outlook going for him. But about this time, he finds Carol Ann Fugate, who was 13 at the time. Is that about what age she was?
She had just turned 12. Well, Charlie, when he met Carol, he was 17, and she was had just turned 13. So at the time of the killing, she was 14 and he was 19.
Yeah, just personally, I have an 18-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son and an 11-year-old son, but I look at them and I look at their friends, and I'm looking at, I'm reading this story about this 19, 18-year-old kid, 14, 12, 13, 14-year-old girl, and I'm just trying to picture what it must have been like in the 50s. When you think of Starkweather and you hear his crimes, just for the layperson that's just kind of picks it up as they go. He was they were so young to be doing what they, were accused of doing or what they did. It's just amazing that they were that age when all this was going down.
Yeah, and when you look at Carol, it's important to keep in mind that she was a girl. She was 14, really 13 when she came into Charlie's orbit. Mm-hmm. She came from a very dysfunctional, violent, alcoholic family. Her dad was a convicted pedophile. And she was, on the wrong side of the tracks in Lincoln, on the poor side of town, very unsophisticated, had never been out of the town of Lincoln at the time. Charlie came from a more stable household. There were 7 kids. They were poor. Dad didn't work very much. He had an illness. But Carol was in my view, was what they call a sitting duck for Charlie. She was never the first person in anybody's life. She was fighting for survival. She changed schools like at least once a year. And Charlie came along and said, "You're it for me. You're the most important person." It's not an uncommon phenomena that males do with distressed women. They come in and promise to be their savior. And that's what, in my view, that's how Charlie kind of hooked her into his life.
And he kind of met her when he dropped out of school his senior year. He took a job at a newspaper warehouse. And so this job, it was kind of near her school, and he started visiting her every day after school.
Yeah, there's some stories. There's some stories that that there was violence between them at that time, that he would jerk her off school buses and so forth, and that she would hide from him in bathrooms in the school. I've never been able to substantiate any of that. And those stories also came up much later, like 15 years later. But Charlie taught her to drive his car when she was 14 years old. And he would often leave it close to the school, and she would walk to the car and drive to where he was working or drive to his home.
So racing cars, working on cars, all that was really important to him.
Don't forget guns.
Oh yeah, and guns too. And he started getting like this this worldview of, you know, he needed to have power over others, and he started having fantasies about bank robberies, and he just started having this real antisocial behavior, and living in his car. You know, he couldn't hold a job, and he worked, you know, as a garbage collector.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened with him is he developed a really intense kind of complete fantasy about the life that would make him, that would fulfill him, that would make him happy. And that life was going to be a short one. And he was going to be an outlaw, and he was going to have a shootout, and he was going to go out in a blaze of glory. And all he needed really was a girl at his side. Carol kind of fit that slot for him in his life. And once he had Carol, he was ready to go. He had no intention of living very long. Life wasn't very good for him, but he developed this kind of outlaw cowboy fantasy. And I think it's the world he was in when this started. And when he killed his first victim was a flight attendant at a gas station outside of Lincoln. And he did that, in my view, to kind of test out the fantasy that murder would work, that it would make him happy, that he would enjoy it, that it would give him some sort of satisfaction. He was trying to move from his fantasy into reality. So he kind of picked out this guy at random and killed him. And by his own memoirs and statements he made, it was a satisfying experience for him. And that kind of laid the groundwork. Then he saw that his fantasy could turn into reality. In fact, he did turn it into reality.
Yeah, for sure. Now you're talking about Robert Culver. He was the guy that was working at the gas station, and you know, Charlie was sleeping in his car. You know, he'd go to the gas station, and he went there actually a couple times during that night, November 30th, late 1957. And he was, you know, buying things here and there, like small items. He wanted to buy a small stuffed animal on credit for Carol. And that's when Robert Culver was like, no, I'm not going to sell you that on credit. And that was just enough. I think was he just kind of looking for a reason to shoot him and kill him and rob him?
Oh, I think so. I think when he left that night, he had a 22.
Mm-hmm.
He had his brother's shotgun with him. And I think when he went out there, he fully intended to rob it and probably, you know, kill somebody. He could have done it all without killing him. He had a mask and so forth, although theoretically Culver could have identified him through other characteristics. But I think he really went out there with the intention of robbing and killing, which he did.
Yeah, and he forced the guy into his car. He got like $100 from the station, from the till, and he drove Robert to a remote area, kind of outside of Lincoln, and to get away from the station, where they kind of had they grappled over the gun, and then Starkweather shoots him in the head. So it was not necessarily probably planned exactly how he wanted it to go, but he kind of targeted this guy working late at night alone at a service station, takes him out to a remote location, and then he pretty much gets away with it. They didn't know it was Starkweather that did it until after they caught him for the other murders. And he confessed to it voluntarily that he had shot Robert Culver.
Yeah, I mean, they had no indication. First of all, they thought it, because it was a gas station on the outside of town, they thought it was a transient. Mm-hmm. So that was their focus in the beginning. And we all know how many cases are screwed up when the prosecutors or the cops get an assumption early on about what happened, and it directs their focus. But they had an opportunity to get him and to finger him and didn't. They missed it. And had they followed up on that opportunity, they would have come up with Charlie pretty clearly. And the rampage that then started on January 21st, leading to 10 people's murder, would never have happened.
You make a good case throughout the book that the police, and you're really truthful about it. You're not anti-police, but you make a good case throughout the entire book that they dropped the ball on several instances with the Culvert murder. They didn't follow up on some things. And then later, when Carol's family is shot during that spree, starting on the 21st of January, 1958, that a lot of red flags were kind of ignored or just kind of passed over.
Yeah, I mean, it's in being critical of them, it's also important for me to keep in mind what policing was like in 1958 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Lincoln was, I call, a big, small town. They had 2 cops at night patrolling Lincoln. The training involved the trainee going on working with a patrolman on his rounds for 2 weeks. And then and then he was a cop himself. So it was very unsophisticated. So in being critical, which I am, there were 2 opportunities, I believe, to put this to avoid a lot of the bloodshed. I try and keep that in mind, but they did. They had the opportunity the morning of the 21st to figure out what had happened, that there had been a murder there. All they had to do was to go out into the backyard and look in the buildings, and they would have found 3 bodies. And they were out there investigating a possible crime scene, and it didn't occur to them to go out into the backyard and open the door. If they did, it would have been 10:30 in the morning, and they had a good chance of catching Charlie. It's speculative, but they had a good chance of catching him before he made it to Bennett and started killing people at 4:00 that afternoon.
Yeah, January 21st, Charlie goes to Carol's house. Her parents were not impressed with him at all. They did not like this budding relationship between the two. They accused him of impregnating their daughter. Charlie went there, looks like with the intent, he said he was going to go hunting with her father-in-law, but that was not what was happening. When he went over there with a gun to shoot and kill him, he gets in arguments with the mother, the stepfather. He slaps Carol's mom. They tell him to stay away. Dad comes out, or stepdad comes out with a hammer to try and get Charlie the hell out of there. And then Charlie decides to kill the mother, the stepfather, Velda and Marion Bartlett. Then he kills the 2-year-old sister of Carol and hides the bodies outside, like you said. The cops come over because the grandmother is very worried, hasn't spoken to him. She knows something's going on. The police come over. They look around, kind of peeking in the windows and whatnot. They leave. And so the bodies are hidden there outside in the cold January Nebraska weather, out in this building, this shed, whatever in the back, for almost 6 days.
Yeah. And it kind of, that's one, there's a great deal of dissent, let's put it that way, over Carol's guilt or innocence in every aspect of the story. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people point at is the fact that she stayed there with Charlie for 5 or 6 days. And he told her that he had her parents hostage and little sister hostage somewhere, and that if she ran, he was going to have them killed. It's kind of a slim story, but you have to keep in mind she's 14. But the fact that she stayed there with him, people came to the door. She had an opportunity. 2 police came to the door in the middle of the week, and she told them everything was fine. First of all, she woke up Charlie and told them they were coming. And then she told them everything was fine. There was no problem, that everybody had the flu. Mm-hmm. So there were opportunities for her to flee in that first week if, in fact, she wasn't participating with him in the crimes. and she didn't take him. Now, her explanation was the hostage theory. But and what happened was on the seventh day, the grandmother called the cops and said, "Come over here. I know there's a problem." And she had been harassing them before. What they saw as harassment. So they sent two cops out there. But their main reason for doing it was to get her off their back. They didn't really see a crime scene there. So the two of them went into the house, looked around the house, missed blood splatter, missed shells on the floor, missed a shotgun that had a sawed-off barrel, missed all sorts of items like that. And the fact, and they were saying, well, they're probably on vacation. Well, the car was in the driveway. So where were the people? If you didn't have two-car families in Belmont area of Nebraska in those days. So they missed all of this information just through pure negligence. Like I say, had one of them, they had to walk by those buildings or at least see them coming and going. Had one of them just gone over there and opened the door, they would have seen what had happened.
Yeah, when you write it so well in the book and your descriptions of everything. So yeah, they come over, they look, and there's shell casings on the ground. They miss the blood splatter, like you said. It is cold, January Nebraska weather. So they are out in this shed in the back. So, if it was during the summer, they would have noticed the scent of the bodies. And it's the grandmother, yeah, very suspicious, found the house empty. Like you said, the car in Belmont. And the Belmont area was, a total blue collar neighborhood in Lincoln. So yeah, like you said, like having two cars was not commonplace in that area of town for sure.
They just had running water there about a couple months before the killings.
Right. And so, it ended up being like Charles's brother and his friend. They were looking for the gun that Charlie borrowed. And then they're the ones that end up finding the stashed bodies. And then they call the police. And then there's an alert to pick up Carol and Charlie because they don't know what's going on. They don't know if they're dead or if Charlie did. They have no idea what's going on.
And that's just about the time that they find the bodies and put the alert out for Charlie and Carol in his car. Mm-hmm. Is about the time that Charlie and Carol are in Bennett and Charlie murdered a farmer there that he knew and had hunted on his land. Murdered him about the same time that the alert went out.
Yeah. And it's, Charlie doesn't know a lot of people. I mean, he's only 19 and he doesn't have very many friends. And so he goes to this place outside of outside of Lincoln, like you said, Bennett, where this guy, August Meyer, has his farm. Charlie knows him just from hunting on his land and gets his car stuck out there and goes to the house looking for some help because he knows August and he thinks he's got some money there or some guns or he can hide out there or whatever. And to repay this guy's kindness, he ends up shooting his dog and killing the dog and then, shotgun blast to August Meyer's head.
It was the back of his head. August was supposedly they were going to, Charlie was going to borrow some of his horses to get his car out of the ditch.
Right.
And August goes back in. It's unclear what he was going back in for, but probably to get his coat. That's what Carol said. And Charlie comes up behind him with his 12 gauge and blows his head off in front of Carol. There's some dispute over where she was, but how close she was. But she clearly witnessed it and saw the body and saw the murder. And if you believe that she wasn't there when Charlie killed her parents, that's a critical issue in the whole story is, was she there when Charlie killed her parents and her little sister? Mm-hmm. Charlie initially said time and time again under oath that she wasn't there, that she didn't, come home, that he killed them around 2. She got home around 4. He cleaned up the house in that time period. She always said, I wasn't there. I came home at 4. There was nobody there. I didn't, I never saw my parents again or my little sister.
Right.
If which one of those two you believe really drives the rest of the story, because if she saw him murder her parents and her little sister, well, her mother and her stepfather and little sister, and went along with him. That does away with the hostage story. That just obliterates that. So it makes it into a liar. And it's a lot easier to find her as a participant in the crimes if she knows what he's done, if she witnessed it and still went with him. If she wasn't there, the first time she would have noticed that he was a murderer was when he blew the back of the head off of August Meyer. And that sets up the whole issue. If that's true, and she, was witnessed that certainly would have had a traumatic impact on a 14-year-old girl. That affects then how you look at her participation in the rest of the crimes.
Oh, for sure. I know. And even when he was apprehended, his initial statements, and then for a while afterwards, he maintained that she did not know that her parents were and sister were murdered, and then later changed the story. That said that she was the most trigger-happy person that he ever met.
Yeah, by the time of her trial, he was accusing her of killing Carole King, one of the two teenagers that were murdered outside of Bennett. And he also accused her of murdering her little sister and of murdering the maid at the Ward house. Yeah. So by the time it was all over, and the cops never accused her of actually murdering anybody. They accused her of a felony murder. But they believed that she did it. There's no question the cops believed that she had killed people. And Charlie gave him the specifics. But by that time, I mean, he was totally incredible. He'd shifted so many times that you couldn't trust anything he said. But he was very clear in the beginning that she didn't know her parents were dead and that she did not participate in any of the killings, that he did them all.
Right. So we were just talking about how he shot 71-year-old August Meyer, takes his gun out there in Bennett, Nebraska, kills the dog. They decide to flee the area. They get back in their car. Now, this is like January, winter in Nebraska, and these aren't paved roads. There's no street lights. This is way out in the boonies. I mean, there's nothing out there in between these small towns. Just moonlight and starlight. That's about it. So they drive their car, they get stuck in the mud again, and they ended up abandoning the vehicle. And there's like this old rundown school storm cellar that they kind of try and take refuge in. And then you mentioned Robert Jensen and Carole King. They're two teenagers that were just going out for a drive together one night. They happen upon Starkweather and Carole, and they stopped out of the kindness of their hearts to give them a ride.
Yeah, and that's typical of Nebraska then, and I believe today. I mean, it's pitch black. Two strangers are walking down the street. You don't know them, and they're carrying rifles. Carol's got the shotgun. Charlie's got the rifle that he took from August Meyer's house. And Charlie hitchhikes him, and they stop. And he puts his thumb out for him, and they stop and let him in. Initially, Robert Jensen, he's a year older than Carole King, but they're in the same class because he had polio as a boy and was held back. So they're two of the five members of the junior class of Bennett High School. Mm-hmm. And they're just, Nebraska farm kids. And this making the decision to stop, ends both of their lives. Charlie ends up going back to the storm cellar, killing Robert Jensen, and then killing Carole King just a few minutes later with the 22. Now later on, he started saying that Carole was the one who had shot Carole King with the 22, and he also mutilated her pretty badly with a knife.
Oh, for sure, yeah. The nature of the crime is horrific. Those teenagers, I can't imagine the amount of sheer terror that went through, especially Carole's mind, because Robert was shot first in the.
Yeah. So think though, you put your finger right on it. think of those. When I wrote these crimes, I lived them.
Yeah.
It's not like other books that I've written where people die. You keep a little distance. I didn't know them, but I did know them, and I knew the country, and I knew the people there, and I relived the murders as I wrote them, and I came across just what you said. There was about 2 minutes when Carole King saw Charlie Starkweather kill Bobby Jensen, where she knew she was dead.
Yeah.
She knew that her life was over, that there was no way he was going to kill Bobby Jensen and leave her alive. Those few moments of realization and terror are the most kind of horrific moments in the whole story for me personally.
Yeah. Like I said, with having kids, I can't, especially an 18-year-old daughter, I just, and happening here in Nebraska, I went to the university down there in Lincoln, and that's where I met my wife. And I've driven a lot of these roads and been around the rural areas around Lincoln and Omaha, and just, and the way that you write, I'm going to give you a compliment in the midst of this horrible account that we're going through. You really take a reader. And I think that if you're not from Nebraska, you really get a real good sense of the isolation of a cold January night in Nebraska. You get a real good sense of the history of the late 1950s. The way you turn a phrase and describe a situation, you really put the reader right there in the midst of it, and you really get a sense of the horrific nature of this entire ordeal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, particularly the focus that you had on it. One of the goals I had was to write about Nebraska in a way that most people outside of Nebraska weren't used to. The typical take on Nebraska is somebody from New Jersey is driving to LA, and they go through from one end to the one side to the other, and all they see are cornfields. And I know that Nebraska is different, that it was different back then than that perception. There's incredible beauty and history in the state. And so I kind of saw this, and you have to be from a place to be able to do that. You can't parachute somebody in from New York City and have them create that feeling of Nebraska. So for you to respond that way is a great compliment, because it was very important for me to do that in this book, to give the reader from San Francisco or Portland or LA a feeling for Nebraska back then and now.
Yeah, not just the landscape of the land, but also, the temperament and the mentality of the people too, because you talk about, and I'm sure this is a lot. I mean, you can pick any small town in between the Pacific and the Atlantic and maybe have the same kind of thing or feeling about the 1950s. But just when you're talking about these murders, especially after they find these two, and they know, because the parents are looking for these kids that are missing that night, so their bodies are discovered, and they find August Meyer. Like, all this is starting to unfold now, and the sheer panic that happens in the city of Lincoln, this big small town, the sheer panic, people taking up arms, hiding in their houses, driving around with pistols and guns, looking for this murderer. They don't know who it is at this point, but they know something is going on. And as they're looking out there in Bennett, Nebraska, and they're finding all this that's unfolded, all this tragedy that's unfolded, Starkweather and Carole, they're driving back into Lincoln, and they go back to her house, or to that neighborhood in the Belmont area, not too far from Memorial Stadium. And they see the cop cars that have discovered the bodies of her family. And then they start to panic. And so they go now to this wealthy section of Lincoln. They don't go to Colorado. They don't go to Arizona. They drive to this wealthy section of Lincoln, and they start kind of plotting their next move, or Charlie's plotting the next move of where they can hide out. They need to get a different car, because they're driving Jensen's car around now.
I mean, that's kind of inadvertently what traumatized Lincoln, but the whole state. And I've talked to people that from South Dakota, Iowa, Northeast Iowa, Kansas, Central Abilene, Kansas, that were traumatized when Charlie was on the run and they were sitting in their houses with their doors locked. It goes way, every time I go somewhere or somebody calls me up and they're saying, I lived in Cedar Rapids and we closed the school. Mm-hmm. That's how far that terror spread. And what set it up was, what made it so terrifying was that he seemed to be everywhere. Nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Nobody ever saw him during this reign of terror. Nobody ever saw the car. Nobody ever saw him. They just kept coming up with bodies, and he wasn't going anywhere. In the beginning, after Meyer, they thought he would be in Bennett, or he would head off to the West Coast. They were even thinking he might go out there to see a brother. And instead, he comes back into Lincoln and continues killing people there. And it was so patternless. It was so random. And it was the randomness of it. I mean, he could be in your garage. He could be in your basement when you came home, because he had already done it. He'd proven that he could do it. The cops were totally outfoxed by him. They were at least one crime scene behind. When they were finding the bodies, he was killing August Meyer. When they found the Ward bodies at the Ward house on Wednesday, he was in Wyoming killing people. They were never even close to him. And that sense of weakness or vulnerability to this guy absolutely terrorized the whole city in particular, but the state as well. I mean, there were people in Scotts Bluff that were locking down, and one guy would go out to milk the cows, the other guy would stand next to him with a shotgun.
Oh yeah,
a lot of stuff like that. It was really, and that was another challenge to make real the fear that was in the average citizen in Lincoln and Nebraska when this was going on.
Sure. I mean, murders didn't really happen a lot in this part of the country, in Lincoln and Omaha. There weren't a lot of murders like this in 1957, 1958. So, like, you got a guy from a gas station shot and killed. Well,
Robert,
like you said, right? You might think it's a transient. It's a one-off kind of thing, and we'll investigate it the best we can. Then 3 people killed in a house, and then 2 people found in a storm shelter, an old farmer murdered. And then you said there's the sheer panic or the fear that you'd come home and find Starkweather or the murderer in your house. He's hiding in your basement. And that's exactly what happened when Mr. Ward came home. Chester Lower Ward came home. His wife, she came home first. Starkweather and Carol, were parked outside the house. She comes home. She gets stabbed to death. The maid gets killed. He comes home. The father, who's a prominent businessman, a young prominent businessman, had his whole incredible future ahead of him. He gets killed. And now, if Nebraska wasn't in panic mode already, now it's in the rich, upwardly mobile, jet set part of town, where now another 3 bodies are found in this part of town, this nice part of town. And I've driven past that house a few times and just known that it's happened there. And just even now, it's in a stately part of Lincoln.
Yeah, I toured the house. The family who lived there was very nice and let me go through and take pictures and so forth. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of they've remodeled it somewhat over the years, but the essence of it is exactly pretty much the way it was. They've added here and there, and you can't help but get a strange feeling from it, even though it's 60 some years later of what happened there. And I know the kids, not so much now, but for about 30 years afterwards, lived in the house, called it the murder house. Mm. It's about a block away from the country club. And the fact that even these people weren't safe. He wasn't just killing farmers and gas station attendants and, whoever, kids. He was killing one of the most prominent men in Lincoln at the time and his family. That created the worst, most intense terror. And it only went on for about 4 hours before they captured Charlie outside of Douglas, Wyoming. But for those 4 hours, it got out that they had found these bodies, and that once again they didn't know where they were. No one had ever seen him.
Yeah.
And then now they figured he was still in Lincoln. Well, of course, Charlie was gone from Lincoln by now, but they thought he was still there. They brought out the National Guard. They closed down schools. Parents went to pick up their kids with carrying rifles and shotguns. And there was a lot of vigilante stuff that was on the verge of happening. Had it gone on much longer, there was the sheriff had a sheriff's posse, which was kind of a formal thing that rode in parades and so forth. And really didn't do much, but he asked them to meet him at the courthouse, and they were going to help look for Charlie. Well, they got out over the radio that sheriff was looking for a posse. So every gunslinger in town went down there with their rifles, and they were drinking. And, people with red hair stayed in the basement. They were getting pulled over by these people.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody kind of agrees, had it gone on into that evening, somebody else was going to die, not at the hands of Charlie Starkweather.
The way that you write about it in your book, it's masterful. You're talking about law enforcement agencies all over the region with sending officers house-to-house searches. Governor Anderson, like you said, activates the Nebraska National Guard. The chief of police is having like searches of the city. Everybody's having these sightings of Starkweather. It's not him. The police department doesn't know where to really look, and these vigilante gangs, this posse of armed men that he found in bars. It's incredible. Like I've read other books and accounts of Starkweather just being a Nebraska guy, and there's always something lacking. And I think it's because, like you said, it's, somebody from New York or LA coming in here for a week or something like that. Or maybe doing research, just looking at old newspaper accounts. But it really takes somebody, I think, from Nebraska to really put boots on the ground, do a little gumshoe work, walking around and interviewing people who's still around, but just the sense of fear, because the murders were horrific, but it's almost like the state of Nebraska was another victim of losing its innocence, losing a sense of security, losing a sense of safety with all this going on.
Safety is the key word right there. I think after World War II, the country felt it'd make the world safe, at least for the time being, but particularly in the Midwest, in the heartland, as it's commonly referred to. There was not rampant crime. If there was a murder, it was a domestic incident, or it was a robbery, or it was a gang thing. There was a point, there was a purpose to it. Strangely enough, I mean, it wasn't random. So as long as you lived a clean life and didn't get crosswise with anybody, you were safe. It didn't occur to people that they could be murdered in their house. Or in their garage or whatever. And this broke that sense of safety. It just blew it up. And Lincoln and Nebraska ever since really has had a hard time trying to reconcile what happened in that time period to who they were, really.
I wanted to highlight a quote from your book, and to get to this, there was, let's see, page 358, you write in here, it was the beginning of the love affair between television and violent crime. The story went from the murder rampage to the electric chair in less than 18 months. The world had never seen anything like it at all. So one thing that's going on too is the advent of like the news, how the news is covered starting in the late 1950s. Like we are starting to get feeds to Nebraska from Nebraska. And so the nation's newspapers, nationwide television coverage, this was brand new. Nothing like this has ever happened and covered in such a way ever before this Starkweather case. And so you've got David Brinkley at night giving nightly updates about all this going on and just telling the whole nation about what's going on here in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yeah, and it was, as you said, I mean, television, at this point, 85% of the households had television. Most of them were still black and white, but it was television. And the couple things that figured into it, getting the amount of coverage and publicity that did not only around the country, but around the world. There were correspondents from London and Tokyo and Brazil covering the trial. But some of the things that set it up was it was kind of a Bonnie and Clyde sort of thing. It was a young boy who looked like James Dean. It was a 14-year-old girl. And they were on the run for 5 or 6 days. So it got covered every night. And people got kind of, well, what's happening with Starkweather and Fugate now? Oh, they murdered more people here, more people there. And as you said, Huntley and Brinkley could now interview their local affiliate in Lincoln or Omaha about what had happened that day. So the person at 24th and Franklin, where I lived, you were having these killers in your living room every night. It was not the same as print or radio. That you were seeing them come out of the courthouse, or Charlie mainly, as the trial goes on, and you see pictures of them when the car comes back. You see TV when the car comes back, carrying them from Wyoming into the pen. So you've got them in your living room, in your house. You've got images of them. And that's really the first time that had happened in the country, and of bringing violence into the public square. And it set, in my view, kind of opened up a whole new window to violence.
Oh, for sure. And so Charlie and Carol, they're fleeing in the Ward's Packard, this nice car that these two teenagers are driving. Now they're out of Nebraska. They're driving to Wyoming. They're just driving west. And they need to get a different car. And they happen upon this poor guy, this Merle Collision, is that his name? Collison,
yes.
This poor guy, he's a shoe salesman, and he's taking a nap alongside the highway just out there by Douglas, Wyoming. And so they happen upon him. He's fatally shot. They try and escape in his car, take his car. And then the whole thing, like how he's captured, is incredible too. A passing motorist tries to help him because Starkweather can't figure out the car because it's got a parking brake. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. He's the car stalls. This guy, this Joe Sprinkle, stops to help. Starkweather threatens him with the rifle. Then the sheriff drives by about the same time, which is incredible. And then that's the end of it. Fugate runs out, yells at the cop, yells that this is Charlie Starkweather. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. And then there's a car chase going after Starkweather over 100 miles an hour. And because Charlie thinks that he's been shot when the back windshield shatters when the cops are shooting at him, he gets glass cut in his head. He thinks he's been shot. That's the only time that he stops and surrenders, because he thinks he's shot.
Yeah, and he would have, well, first of all, when they were chasing him, they went through the town of Douglas itself, which is kind of hard to imagine, but he drove back through Douglas, headed back toward Nebraska. Yeah. And the cop car with the sheriff and the police chief of Douglas were right on him with their sirens going and their lights flashing down through the center of Douglas. And it's almost like a kind of a caper, kind of a comedy caper scene where they are starting, now they know who it is. So they jam up the bumper. They lock onto the bumper of the Packard, and Charlie gooses it and breaks loose and takes off. And then now they're in the country. That's when they're going about 100, 110 miles an hour out there. And finally, the deputy sheriff gets his rifle out and starts shooting him 30. And that's when he hit the back window. Now, Charlie will always said that he would have had a shootout with him, but he was out of ammunition. And as far as I can tell, that's probably true, because they had been doing a lot of shooting with the 22s. And his fantasy was to actually get killed in a shootout. Now the cops will say, and the people say, now he was a coward. The first time he saw his own blood, he, caved and gave in. And that's plausible too, actually.
Sure. Who knows what was going on in his mind exactly at that time? Because his story changed a lot too after he was captured. Okay. And then he was extradited from Wyoming to Nebraska. Wyoming did not have the death penalty then, right?
No, they had it, but Governor Simpson would never allow it to be used.
Okay.
He was always going to pardon them or whatever. That's not quite the right word, but no one was ever going to be executed. So they decided. They got Charlie and Carol from Douglas, Wyoming to Lincoln in about 24 hours, 36 hours. It's amazing how fast they got that extradition process and drove them all the way back. But yeah, they what they were worried about was that if they convicted him there, and the governor, that's the word, commuted his sentence, that it would be, something could happen then between then and sending him back to Nebraska, where they would electrocute him. So the governor and the county attorney just said, all right, you can take him, just get him out of here. Plus they said, we've only got one that was killed here. You've got 10 that were killed there.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's extradited back to Nebraska. And of course, you covered the trial in great detail, how Carol is questioned and without a lawyer, just how his Starkweather's story changes. You can't really trust anything he says. And back in the 50s, they didn't have forensics like they do now. People contaminated crime scenes. I thought it was interesting that local photographers were hired to come in and take the photos. Like the police department didn't take the photos themselves. They contracted photographers to come in and document the crime scenes. Just all that's so different than what you see nowadays in an investigation of murder and crimes like this. They didn't have near the forensics or anything like that now, or back then like they do now.
But even that's absolutely true. But they didn't protect the crime scenes at all, which is amazing to me. That you think would be instinct. Some of the pictures of Carole King and Bobby Jensen down in the bottom of this cave cellar were taken by farmers.
Yeah. Oh.
They walked a couple steps down, and she's pretty much naked. It's a very difficult photograph for a lot of people, and for anybody. There's a lot of blood around, and it's a gruesome scene. And these farmers were walking down there taking, the picture that I've seen was not taken by a cop, it was taken by a farmer. And there was no tape around the scene. People were coming and going, and shells, they finally looked for shells by burning all the grass when the snow melted, and, came up with it was just so primitive. And it's, you just think that somebody would say, protect the crime scene and protect these people who've been murdered.
He's extradited quickly back to Nebraska. They put together this case pretty quickly. It goes to trial. Compared to nowadays, relatively pretty fast. The jury deliberates for 22 hours. He's only charged for the murder of Jensen. And then he's sentenced to death. Executed in Lincoln in the electric chair in 1959. So this long process that we're used to now, where somebody's sentenced to the death penalty, sentenced to death row, and then decades go by. He was executed in 1959.
He was executed in 15 months from when he was convicted. And most of the appeals were kind of ritual.
Sure.
And there's a reason for it without sounding like a law professor. The whole federal system of appeals and rights under the 14th Amendment to due process and so forth had not been brought down, and habeas corpus had not been brought down on the states yet. That happened a few years later under Escobedo and Wainwright. So you didn't have all these challenges that you have now in the that brings the whole federal law system down on the state and can drag it out for the 19 or 20 years. No, but and he ended up he didn't want to claim insanity. his lawyers did it against his instructions. So he really didn't have an end. Well, let's look at it this way. I mean, he was gonna die, and he didn't really fight it. I think his first goal would have been to have a shootout, but then at some point he thinks, this execution is going to be as big a deal as a shootout, and I'm going to drag it out, and I'm going to get a lot of publicity for myself, and I'm going to write a book about it, and I'm going to probably go down bigger and badder in history than if I'd have had a shootout.
Yeah. I mean, that was his mentality then. I mean, obviously he was evil, I guess is a good word, to carry out these murders, but just his mentality of, I'm going to go out. First of all, I want this blaze of glory. I'm going to have a shootout with the cops. When he can't have that, then he's not going to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. He didn't want to be known as a crazy person. He really wanted to be known as this outlaw.
That's right. I mean, an outlaw looked like James Dean, which was even a bigger deal. He learned how to pose like Dean. He learned how to hang a cigarette out of his mouth like James Dean, how to kind of have this alienated, rebellious look on his face when he looked at the camera. He played it to the hilt. I think, somebody asked me, what do you think Charlie would think about it now? He'd say, I think he'd be happy about the whole thing. I mean, he really wrote the script on this thing, and he was completely happy with the way it ended.
Yeah. Now, and all the time he was insisting later on that while he killed most of the victims, Carol had murdered several as well, and she maintained that she didn't. The jury found in her trial that her testimony that she was Starkweather's hostage, they didn't find that very credible. And then she was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nebraska Correctional Center over there in York, Nebraska. And then later on in 1973, they commuted her sentence, making her eligible for parole. And Governor and later Senator Exon voted to have her sentence commuted. She was paroled.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing to analyze and probably not worth going through. But he did the end of it was she was out on parole. They had to delay it a couple of times because of some real strange provisions in the statute. But in the end, the point of it all is that she was paroled in 1976.
Yeah, and then she relocated to Michigan and just kind of led a quiet life, which was very interesting because you make a point in your book of saying that she had no violent outbursts or anything before these murders. And then after being paroled or even in jail and then later being paroled, like she led a quiet, respectable life, just no trouble. I don't even know. She had a parking ticket after all this. And so she was this violent, trigger happy, murderous person. After getting paroled in the 1970s, she had no signs of any kind of problems in society.
She got married to a man who had 4 sons, and she had a stroke, and then she was in a car accident, so she got pretty beat up. But she worked for the same hospital in Michigan for 23 years until she got a pension. Same job, kind of an assistant, surgical assistant. She did things like went down to Mexico with a bunch of girlfriends and marched in parades and read a lot of kind of science fiction books, mystery books, as far as you could. And she babysat. She'd work all day at the hospital and then babysit these 3 kids while the parents went to work from about 6 until 11 o'clock every night. She did that for 7 or 8 years. And so it's hard. It's hard to imagine that. And before this thing with Charlie, she was kind of a rebellious kid, but she wasn't. You didn't see anything in her personality like the monster, sort of like a budding sociopath. Let's put it that way. So you would have had somebody who led a pretty decent childhood, and then went crazy for 7 or 8 days, and then reverted back to this kind of normal person for the next, she's still alive right now, and it hasn't done anything. So, it could happen. You can't rule anything out in the field of psychology, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
No, and let me compliment you on, I was reading through your book, and of course you detail the history impeccably. And then I really enjoyed, or I really got a lot of, and I read it twice, the epilogue that you wrote at the book. And I don't want to give it away for people that are interested in this and they want to buy your book, but I do want to talk a little bit about your epilogue because it is very personal to you, how you came back to Nebraska and you kind of confronted things in your life, some painful things in your life, your history, but also intertwined with this whole ordeal of Charlie Starkweather. And you went and visited your old schools, and you visited the crime scenes, and you visited Charlie's old school, and you looked where you used to hook up your bike. And I kind of did something similar last year. I just had a couple days off from work, and I just kind of went back to my elementary school, and like going back into your past and kind of visiting these old memories and confronting these ghosts. I found it very fascinating, especially the part where you went to Wyuka Cemetery. And I've been to Starkweather's grave, and where you went to his grave and you put your foot down and you pressed down on his stone. And I think you said something about, or wrote something about, you're trying to like push him into the ground further. Or I just found it so powerful and so personal. Again, somebody from Nebraska, confronting the past of these atrocities that happened here.
Yeah, and part of it is that my childhood was difficult. My father had died, and my sister had died, and so my brother and I were kind of running around. I mean, my mother remarried a wonderful man, but we were kind of running around loose ourselves and getting in trouble for shoplifting and various things. So going back, and I walked away from this over the years. I was always going to do this, and I'd get ready to do it, and I'd say, oh, I don't know if I want to go through all that stuff again, because when you go back there, where Charlie hung out was where we hung out, the roller skating rink, Lee's Chicken down on I can't Pioneer Park Boulevard or whatever, and so you're going to unearth all your old stuff too. And it did happen. And the thing in Wyuka that got me, the hardest thing was going to where the storm cellar was, and then going and seeing the graves of Carole King and Bobby Jensen. But the Starkweather thing, what got me there was that he wasn't that far away from his victims. The Wards, the husband and wife, were there. And Carol's mother, stepfather, and little sister were there, not that far away from Charlie. And something just seemed wrong about that. Yeah. Seemed obscene,
Yeah. And when you talk about, the kind of carnival atmosphere outside the Nebraska State Penitentiary when Charlie was executed, I was in college when Willie Ote was executed. Oh, yeah. And I went down not to party outside the penitentiary. I walked around the entire carnival atmosphere because I'm pretty anti-death penalty. And I walked around the whole carnival atmosphere, and I watched a lot of my fellow college guys, drinking beer in the parking lot and having signs that said "fry 'em" and all this kind of shit. And his victim, who is Jane McManus, she's buried over by my parents. And so when I was a teenager, after my dad died when I was 15. So long story short, my mom and I, when we'd visit my dad's grave, my mom would always have a flower for Jane McManus, who was, Willie Ote's victim. So just, I personally took a lot out of you visiting Wyuka where the victims are, because I always see Jane McManus's grave a couple times a year because it's over by my parents. And I was at the state pen when Willie Ote was executed. And I grew up in Omaha as a kid in the 80s when John Joubert was going through his rampage, abducting the newspaper boys and killing them here in Omaha. And so even though I wasn't around during the Starkweather time, I just felt like just such a connection through your writing to these kind of terrible events, and just kind of made me think about, history and law enforcement and how we pursue justice and things like that. It's just the human condition for sure.
That's interesting. When was Otay executed?
He was executed in 93, I believe.
Right.
That was the first one since Starkweather.
Since Starkweather, that's what I thought.
And they really did a dumb thing to it at the state pen. Like he walked from his cell or however he was housed at death row to the execution chamber, and he was able. They didn't do this with Joubert, but Otay. There's a famous picture from the World Herald or the Journal-Star newspaper of him, like the light was on behind him, and you see kind of his silhouette, and he was like waving to his supporters outside, and it was like
you got a photograph of that.
Yeah, there's I remember seeing it in the paper and just being like, "Oh my God!" Maybe it was even in the Daily Nebraskan, but somebody with a really good lens got this shot of him waving to supporters outside, and it's haunting. That, and a half hour later, people were yelling about, "Hey, put him in Sparky," and waiting for the lights to dim and all that stuff.
There's a funny twist on that last thing about the rumor was that the lights were going to dim all over town when they threw the switch. Someone told me that I think she was like a girl at the time, 12 or 13, that the advice they got over the radio or which spread around town one way or another, which was to don't use any electricity around midnight so there would be enough to fry him. I'm going, well, that's a new one. I hadn't heard that before.
I remember that. Yeah, that was, maybe they were just kind of kidding when Otay was executed, but same kind of thing. Like, well, we're going to see the lights dim when they pull the switch. And it was, you got the 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old, guys hopped up on beer for the first time. And, it was a carnival atmosphere. It was really gross. But when you were writing about the same kind of thing happening in 1959, not a lot had changed.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are more sophisticated, but that kind of impulse, that's still a small town thing to do,
Yeah, for sure.
You're not going to do that in New York City. I mean, to kind of celebrate and feel like you won't be arrested for it. You'll be run off, but then you can go back and keep on doing it. That's still Lincoln in a way. I don't mean that in a negative way at all. That's what teenagers do.
No, I get it. And you also had a great postscript, kind of like, you were able to sit down and meet 80-year-old Carol Ann Fugate. And I don't want to give it away, but I just found that very touching, and how you talked about how you walked out of the building after meeting her and visiting with her. It was just a nice postscript to your personal involvement in this story and creating this book.
Thank you. Yeah, I got thrown out.
Right, I didn't want to give it away. I didn't want to give it away, Harry.
Oh, okay. Well, I kind of talked my way into it, and sure. I was surprised that I was able to do it, to tell you the truth. And I'm not sure how many people knew who she was.
She had a different last name. Yeah.
Different last name. She had a Murray last name.
Yeah.
After about an hour, it was kind of over with anyway. They came in and said, "Oh, who are you?" And I told them, and they said, her guardian doesn't think you should be here. So I left, but it really didn't. There wasn't much left to talk about. Carol had a hard time expressing herself in any event, and we had had our meeting. We'd had our conversation. Whatever it was going to be, we had it. So it provided kind of a dramatic ending, but it didn't have much impact, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, this book just came out at the very end of November 2023. And as we record this, we're just a couple weeks away from the anniversary of all this going down. And so I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and from one Nebraskan to another. I think that this book will go down as like the definitive account of the beginning, the murders, the aftermath, and just everything. The whole story is just encapsulated in 400 some odd pages, just masterfully.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to say it's interesting to talk to a fellow Nebraskan about this, even though you're a youngster.
I appreciate that.
You've been raised in the Starkweather, phenomena, and to be able to talk to you about it is it's been interesting and very very interesting and kind of elucidating experience. I appreciate your having me on. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
You bet. I'll talk to you later.
There we go, everybody. Episode 267 of Necronomicast. My pleasure to welcome to the show Harry MacLean, gentleman and a scholar, New York Times best-selling writer, and I'm sure he'll repeat that once again with this incredible book, Starkweather. So this episode is kind of like part 4 of my historic haunted heartland true crime series. Started back in episode 140 with Mark Pettit talking about A Need to Kill, his book about John Joubert. 254, Henry Cordes, the Anthony Garcia case out of Omaha. 255 with Brian Bogdanoff, the Three Bodies Burning case out of Omaha. And now, Charles Starkweather on the Necronomicast. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, coming up on episode 268, it is my pleasure to welcome to the show on February 15th, Josh Darren. Joshua Darren is one of the emerging voices in the world of paranormal exploration and investigation and research out of Alabama. And on Valentine's Day, keep an eye on the socials because I will be announcing the light up for Historic Haunted Heartland Part 3, Reconsider Everything, to be held live on stage, in person, at the beautiful Benson Theater. All kinds of things coming down the road for Necronomicast. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your kind listenership. I hope you all have a great night and a great life. Now, go get some sleep.